E para falar sobre o direito à educação e o processo de judicialização de assuntos ligados à área, o programa Desafios da Educação traz ao estúdio os pesquisadores norte-americanos Suzanne Eckes, da Universidade de Indiana, e Charles Russo, da Dayton University, em Ohio. Eles vieram a São Paulo participar do Seminário NUPPs, Cátedra Unesco, Direito à Educação, que acontece na Faculdade de Direito da USP. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for your time. First of all, I would like to ask you, Dr. Eckes, in your opinion, what's the most prominent challenge for American education today?
I think there are many challenges to American education today, but one of the issues that I focus most on in my research is equity in education and access to education for all students. And something that goes hand in hand with that is school funding and providing an equal opportunity for all students, no matter if you're in a rural or an urban, suburban community, that all students have an equitable education and equal access to education.
Is it a national problem?
I would argue it's absolutely a national problem.
Do you agree with her?
Absolutely.
In your opinion, what's the most important challenge?
Muito obrigado. Thank you for having us with you this morning. As we spoke a little before we started, Suzanne and I agree that access to education is crucial. And I think a part of that, as we talked a little bit, is how do we get family involvement? When I was a child, and I'm older than Suzanne, but the fact that she's here, I'm sure her parents as well were very much involved and interested in her education. So many parents today disengage from their children. They send the kids to school, and I saw a sign in an airport or something. It said, name 3 top fashion models. And the next panel is, can you name your child's teacher? Parents will know the Kardashians and all this other silliness, but they're not involved in the education of their children. So providing the top quality schools and access with adequate funding. Beyond that, an area that Suzanne and I are involved in professionally in our day-to-day activities is how do we prepare better educated school administrators and teachers in America or the United States, somewhat unlike Brazil. To become a school principal, one must require additional degrees and additional courses of study, an additional certification. And many states are trying to water down, if you will, to reduce the requirements to become a principal, to become a superintendent and head of a school system. And it seems to me that without people who are well prepared adequately, professionally, it's going to be difficult for them to lead, to get parents involved, to fight for the funding, to do the things that Suzanne is talking about. So it's kind of a symbiotic relationship. The things we're saying fit together, I think, pretty well.
Mm-hmm. Why does it happen, this problem of equity, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's a systemic problem, just going back to what Dr. Russo just spoke about with teachers and equity. And we have a really hard time in America attracting the best and the brightest teachers to some of our urban and rural, low-income, under-resourced public schools. And that's not to say that we don't have excellent teachers in some of our urban and rural public schools. But it's difficult to attract new teachers, and even to attract new teachers into all schools of education across the country. Enrollment is down in most places, and we need to think of a way to create this pipeline of bringing in very high-achieving, committed individuals to be teachers and school administrators, and not only the nation's best schools, but the nation's schools that are maybe less attractive because teachers are paid less in those communities, or there are more challenges with the students because of socioeconomic status and other issues.
Along those lines, yesterday one of the speakers at the conference said that in Brazil, poorer quality students are drawn to education. The brighter students are to perhaps law or business or medicine. And sadly, in the States, education students tend to score a little bit lower than others. And I agree 100% with Suzanne, of course, that we need to attract the best and the brightest. But I'm not entirely sure, and I'm not suggesting she said this, I'm not sure it's entirely about the money. Part of it is the money. People want to be paid more. but somebody who's a poor teacher is not going to become a better teacher by giving the person more money. How do we get the respect for teachers? I think that education is thought of as a less desirable profession for people to enter into. I've got a cartoon I use very often that basically says that. So there's so many dimensions to it, but again, we agree on so many things. That how do we get the public, though, to care? How do we get the parents to care? I used to teach secondary school, and in my final year, I had some administrative authority. I would very often see a father, who was an all-boys Roman Catholic school, with a son who was going to be disciplined, kept out of school for a few days. And New York City is a little bit different, a little bit more in your face, if you will. And I'd have a piece of paper, and I'd hold it up, and I'd ask him, is that your signature? And the father would say, yes. And I'd say, well, then your signature indicates you agreed to abide by all the rules. Your son broke the rules. Thank you for coming. Have a nice day. At which point he's angry. But then I have his attention, and I can begin to talk to him.
The subject of your speech here in the meeting in São Paulo is student discipline in public schools, law and policies and ethics. What's your focus, and how law and policies could minimize the violence problems and even prevent them?
Sure. My talk later this afternoon at the University of São Paulo Law School will focus on discipline generally, and I'll point out how discipline varies from school district to school district. I started my career as a public high school French teacher in a rural community in the Mississippi Delta region in rural Arkansas. And we use corporal punishment to discipline. Well, not we, I didn't engage in corporal punishment, but the vast majority of the teachers in that particular school district use corporal punishment as a means of disciplining students in that particular school. Now I live in Indiana, where I teach at Indiana University, and the school districts in my immediate area don't engage in corporal punishment and use suspension and expulsion. So I'm going to walk the students through the differences between discipline approaches in the public schools in the United States and the concept of procedural and substantive due process rights for students. And I'll also move into something that's related to student discipline with search and seizure issues. We have a lot of legal issues throughout the United States right now dealing with the Fourth Amendment, and can you search a student if you believe that student maybe has a weapon, or that student possibly has drugs in his or her locker? Can you search a student's cell phone in your class if the student is texting during class and there's a policy at the school that says we prohibit the use of cell phones in school? So a lot of Fourth Amendment issues that arise under this idea of discipline. And I'll also point out some recent reports that have been, recent guidance that have been issued, most recently dealing with disproportionality of African American students and students of color in discipline, and also recent guidance that's come out from the U.S. Department of Education addressing discipline of students with disabilities and the use of restraint and seclusion. So I'm going to touch upon a lot of different discipline issues and legal policy ethic issues very generally today in my session.
But indiscipline is a bigger problem than was in the past, indiscipline in the United States schools?
I would argue that it's certainly changing. I think there's more of a focus on safety in our public schools than maybe there has been in the past because of recent tragedies, from Columbine to more recent tragedies.
A number of years ago, 10 years ago, I don't remember, I was asked to be a keynote speaker at a law conference, or the law conference that meets in Australia, and my topic was discipline and school safety. And I found an article in Time magazine, I think it was, that compared American schools 50 years ago to today. And 50 years ago, the top 10 items included, I don't remember them all, whether young men had their ties up straight, whether their shoelaces were tied, whether they were eating food in class. Today, we worry about drugs in schools, rapes in bathrooms. So, and one thing I think that's unfortunate, there's when you read the newspapers, there's an expression in America, if it bleeds, it leads. You know, the bad stories get the headlines and the attention. They deserve some. But schools are the safest places that kids can be during the school day. more kids die at home at the hands of their parents than do in schools. That being said, we must do more to make schools safer, and the things that Suzanne's going to talk about are practical day-to-day issues for school administrators that I think would fit all around the world. Professor Ranieri at the University of São Paulo has written a chapter in a book of mine and talks about many of these same issues. So there's a real commonality, and I think the issues are the same. We may live 5,000 miles apart, but I think that the issues are pretty much the same.
Mm-hmm. Indiscipline is one of the top of teachers' reclaim here in Brazil. Instructors and educators argue that it's the main cause of absence and a high non-attendance rate. How could we can fight against it? Indiscipline.
I just want to make sure I understood your question. So how can we address discipline to maybe increase high school or middle school attendance levels for students? Because when they're suspended, they're away from school and they're not learning. I see. Okay.
Both sides, the student and the teachers that quit the profession because of that.
Okay, I'll address the second part of the question first, and Charlie, feel free to jump in.
Yeah.
But I do think teachers a lot of times are legally illiterate. They're not aware of what the law says about disciplining students. And teachers absolutely have the right to discipline students in their classroom. And if they're conducting themselves as a reasonable teacher should be conducting his or herself in a given situation, let's say breaking up a student fight, that teacher is absolutely protected from a possible negligent suit. But I think sometimes in America, some of the teachers think I'm not able, and I know there are some school districts that say and have policies that say, don't touch your students only from your shoulder to your elbow. But when you read the case law, students or teachers who discipline the students in a reasonable way are generally not going to be found liable for negligence. We also have the Paul Coverdell Act. It's a federal law that it hasn't been invoked very much, but offers some protections to teachers for disciplining students in several states. My state, I believe it was in 2011, just a few years ago, passed a teacher protection state statute to say when you're in the midst of disciplining a student and you, paraphrasing law, but when you're acting in a reasonable manner, you can do so. And you don't have to fear for your job.
When you talk about kids being absent from school, a topic that comes to my mind almost immediately in Pavlovian style is bullying. So many of the discipline issues surround bullies, and I'm working on an article, Suzanne's working on a chapter for different publications, and we talked about it a little bit. I think one thing that schools need to do is build something into the curriculum someplace, and I'm not particularly touchy-feely. I tend to be more on the intellectual side than the emotive side. But I think we have to teach kids respect for one another, try to get them to understand why we're there, perhaps have peer counseling. But again, it comes back to something I said earlier, and Suzanne and I were talking about earlier as well. How do you get the families to buy in? How do you get the parents to make sure the kids are doing the right thing? Why educators quit. I was telling a story the other day, mostly in jest, about a teacher. One of my first years of teaching, the man lasted for 3 days and quit. I wonder if the people entering into schools really understand what they're getting into, which I think comes back in part to something we alluded to, the quality of teacher education programs, the preparation programs to give the kids, the younger students, an understanding of what they're going into. A real difficulty, I read a report from New York City, my hometown recently, about the reassignment of teachers. The top tier teachers are all assigned to the upper income communities. And the youngest, poorest teachers in terms of quality are in the area, the poorest urban areas of New York City that is most in need of good quality teachers. So there's an inequity in there that overflows into discipline. New York City's discipline rules, I think, are overly soft as an example. I think the disproportionality issue in a place like New York City, where the overwhelming majority of kids is African American, to try to discipline at equal rates really undercuts what the school is trying to do. There's a problem with overproportionality in some areas, but unfortunately a place like New York City is segregated. Chicago is segregated. The numbers there are going to be off, and there's some very serious issues. So some of these reports coming out of Washington look good, but I wonder if they get to the underlying issue of getting kids to want to be there and have families work together, if that makes sense.
And to try to keep the students in school, I couldn't agree more that the professional development and the teacher training and your pre-service teaching programs to address those topics of student discipline and classroom management, so a student isn't being suspended the vast majority of his or her school year, to stay in that classroom and to give that student support to keep that student on track academically and socially is very, very important.
Sure. A question I raise in class when I talk about discipline is whether we should even have out-of-school suspension. For the kids who are sent home for a week or 10 days, it's basically a vacation. The brighter students don't get suspended. They follow the rules. The kids at the bottom who are doing poorly, who don't want to be in school, sending them home for a week is a vacation. I'm not sure I'd want to keep them in the same classroom to be disruptive, but I think they should be kept in school and be given work assignments so they don't fall further behind. We want the most disruptive kids away from the kids who are trying to learn, but to put them out just compounds the problem rather than try to resolve it.
You said about the bullying, but there is the cyberbullying
Part of it
nowadays.
too.
And one thing that it's your point on one of your research is homeschooling. How does it work in the United States? And for us, we Brazilians, to understand it, because we don't have many homeschooling here in Brazil.
If you go back, and I hate to cite a book, but I have a footnote in one of the things I've written. In 1982, homeschooling, the practice whereby parents keep their children home rather than send them to a local public or private or non-public school, was only legal in 2 states. Beginning in 1982 and through the mid-1990s, homeschoolers became a very active group, so that homeschooling is now legal in every jurisdiction, every state in the United States, either under an explicit homeschooling statute or some other language in state laws that make it permissible. One of the difficulties with it is numbers. The person who used to be responsible for homeschooling data at the U.S. Department of Education was herself a homeschooling advocate. There are about 53 million kids in the United States of school age. Right now, about 2.5 million, the largest group, about 40% of that group, are children in Roman Catholic schools. Homeschooling advocates are trying to say there are as many kids in homeschools as there are in Catholic schools. I find that hard to believe. There's another 3 million children who are in other kinds of non-public schools. I think the number is off, but the homeschooling advocacy groups are very strong. They go in and threaten litigation. States very readily defer to them rather than have protracted litigation. 90% of the people, based on data from the homeschooling advocates, are people who educate their children at home for religious reasons. They don't want their children to learn about, say, evolution or gay issues or other issues involving sexuality. And I can understand and respect parental wishes not to have perhaps kids exposed to ideas at too young of an age, but they can't shield their children from everything out there in the rest of the world.
It's a practice. It's allowed in all the
it is
United
legal
States.
One way or the other
illegal.
in every 50 states.
And how courts treats that?
The courts have upheld statutes that allow it. They say about 35 states have laws explicitly that say the homeschooling is legal. Perhaps you have to notify the superintendent or the principal or something. And the others talk about equivalency. If you could show that you're providing equivalent instruction elsewhere, including at home, then parents can do that. A practice, and I don't know what it's like in Indiana, but I think it's there, is that homeschooling families are now beginning to group together. So 4 or 5 families may get together, and you'll do the mathematics, and you'll do the English, and I'll do the history, and they'll go from home to home. But a real issue for me is whether these kids are being appropriately socialized. Ohio just passed a law, along with about 25 other states, that kids who are being homeschooled can now participate in extracurricular activities. High school sports are very, very big in America. And I have mixed feelings. On the one hand, I think it's good that these kids get out and get engaged with other children, but I wonder if they're making the same academic progress as the kids who are in school and have a threat of being left behind if they're not studying. So it's there, but on a positive note, one of the few positives for homeschooling with me is that these are parents who are deeply concerned about the education of their children. I wish we could perhaps redirect it to other ways and direct that kind of energy back into the traditional schools, whether public or non-public, for that parental involvement.
Dr. Eckes, still talking about legal issues. Brazil and the United States are in different moments here nowadays. Wage the educational equity is a priority, and that's the reason of including poor students here in Brazil on higher education courses. What's the matter? What's the point about the subject?
Well, so we talked a little bit about this yesterday at USP, about affirmative action programs in the U.S. and how it differs so much from what's happening in Brazil right now. But until 1978, we weren't quite sure if quotas would be allowed. I understand that in Brazil that a certain number of seats are set aside in higher education for low income or possibly students of color who have traditionally been denied access into post-secondary education. In 1978, quotas were struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court in the U.S. And in 2003, we had two cases out of the University of Michigan, one dealing with the College of Arts and Sciences and one dealing with the University of Michigan Law School, that gave us some greater clarity as to what is allowed with regard to affirmative action, that race can be considered when admitting students into higher education, as well as your socioeconomic status. And you really need to take an individualized approach when admitting students. For example, the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Michigan gave a certain number of points. I can't remember exactly what it was, but if you were, from this racial or ethnic background, you got 10 points on your admission application for entrance into that university. That was struck down as problematic. Whereas the law school took a very individualized, holistic approach and considered race flexibly, along with other factors. The Supreme Court just visited this question again of affirmative action and access to higher education in the Fisher case out of the University of Texas in Austin, upholding the Grutter and Gratz decision, but really stressing too the need to try to think of race-neutral alternatives rather than relying so rigidly on admitting students by race into higher education. So there's been a lot happening with affirmative action, and I don't know what you think, Charlie, but I think there's going to be more litigation in this area. There are different groups that are already setting up websites on some of our better more competitive campuses to say, are you a Caucasian student who's been denied admissions to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, University of Wisconsin? Sign up here. And I think people are looking for plaintiffs to bring additional litigation to perhaps receive some more guidance from the U.S. Supreme Court as to what is and what is not permissible with regard to the consideration of race and ethnicity in admissions in higher education.
As you know, Suzanne, in that Fisher decision out of Texas, the court did strike down the plan at the University of Texas, I don't know where Mexico's coming from, at the University of Texas, saying that they did put too much emphasis, perhaps, on race. It went down to a lower court, which upheld the university's action. However, the young lady who was involved is now appealing back to the Supreme Court, and I'd kind of be surprised if the Supreme Court did not hear the case again. 2 summers ago, I think it's 2 summers ago, the United States Supreme Court in a case out of Michigan, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, Schutte, S-C-H-U-T-T-E, I think it is, upheld a Michigan law that prevents the consideration of race in any kinds of an admission program. The United States Supreme Court, going back for well over 100 years, talks about a colorblind constitution. And I think that's what that decision is trying to move in the direction of, and that's loaded language. At dinner last night, we were speaking with a local friend about this issue. And one thing I was going to say, but the conversation moved, was that I used that expression with a student in one of my courses online. I teach distance learning on the internet. And she was greatly offended by the notion of a colorblind constitution. I'm troubled by that. Regardless of what side one comes down in favor of it, I'd like to see us judge on the basis of the person and avoid making some of these decisions. America does have a poor history with race relations. That's not in dispute. Is it where we'd probably like it to be? I think not. But we've also had similar issues with women and with certain religious groups that are not treated entirely equally. We want to try to get it as best we can, but do we disfavor one group at the expense of another? And those are questions above my pay grade,
yeah, and it's
as
also,
people have said.
It's also couched in the idea of diversity. And the U.S. Supreme Court has recognized diversity as a compelling state interest. So in this country, when we create a policy at a university where one race is treated differently than another, you need to have a compelling reason to do so, and that plan, that policy needs to be very narrowly tailored. So that's an issue I think that universities are grappling with, is how to narrowly tailor that plan.
Our Supreme Court, with the noted diversity of judicial perspectives, all 9 of the justices went to 2 or 3 different law schools. And if you didn't go to Harvard or Yale, you don't get looked at. So
we have a few time now, but I will have to ask you a last question. You led 2 discussions at UNESCO conference. The first one is education as a fundamental right. The second one is the employment rights of teachers, exploring education worldwide. Why did you choose that theme?
Well, partly in conversation with Professor Zananieri, it was what would be of interest to the program. The first presentation, I've been very fortunate. Beginning in 1997, I've done a lot of international travel. And I began working in Sarajevo, Bosnia, right after the war, and it was in a public hearing, a governmental hearing, on how to respect education as a fundamental right. So what I talk about in that presentation, and I've done similar presentations in other parts of the world, I just did it in South Africa a few weeks ago, is I take a look at what education is supposed to be, raise the issues of what the rights of children mean in education, as a prelude to looking at the international documents, from the Declaration on Human Rights to the Rights of the Child and so forth. And then I try to offer some practical recommendations as to what educators, wherever they may be located, whether the United States, Brazil, South Africa, how they can work together with families and legislators to not only provide a greater respect for the recognition of education as a fundamental right, but make that happen so that what can legislators in Sao Paulo do for 200,000 kids? How do you get preschools to open up? I think if we could somehow, and there was a presentation on this yesterday, if we could somehow get into the minds of legislators and make them realize that, at the risk of sounding like a political speech, children are the future. If we don't educate these children now, we're going to be building jails and prisons later because they're going to be uneducated, there's going to be no place to go. So if we can front load the system to get them better educated all the way through, then it's a great deal. And so I think that's one of the things that I will try to stress in that presentation. Teacher rights is somewhat unrelated, not on a direct line, but to give a comparative perspective. Suzanne's going to be throwing some questions at me tomorrow. I'm going to talk a little bit about, again, international conventions, the International Labor Organization, on what that all means as a broad overview. And then I edited a book 2 or 3 years ago, I just don't remember now, on the rights of teachers in 16 or 17 different countries. And I'll talk about some commonalities in terms of job protection, teacher qualifications, religious perspectives in the class, to try to give a more global perspective. One of the things that I've been trying very hard to do for the last 20 years or so, and Suzanne is getting involved now, I'm a bit older, is to recognize that education law, our shared discipline, like so many other disciplines, can be looked at from comparative and international perspectives. I never say, in fact, I bend over backwards to say, I'm an American, this is how we do it in America. I'm not suggesting you do it this way, but we can learn from each other. I think there are commonalities that Brazil can teach America. I think America might have some things to teach Brazil or wherever we go, and to try to draw these international comparisons to make things come out more strongly for everybody.
Dr. Russo, thank you very much. Dr. Eckes, thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you.
O Desafios da Educação fica por aqui e volta no mês que vem com mais conversa sobre os principais desafios da educação no Brasil e no mundo. Até!